You're listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where I talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. Our presenting sponsor is the end-to-end production solution, Green Slate. Whether it's start paperwork, time cards, purchase orders, or reports, everything is digital, everything is on the app, and you can work from wherever you are. The future is actually here. And if you'd like to hear this pitch in person or see it for yourself, call me as I am working there. Here's my number, 310-783-2001, extension 323, or julie.walker@gslate.com. Now, back to my weekend job. For today's episode, I spoke with Kat Rosenfield. Kat is the Edgar-nominated author of 2 young adult novels and most recently collaborated with Stan Lee on his final project, the Audible original Stan Lee's Alliances, A Trick of Light. The title is one of Lee's final collaborations and most innovative works created and finished in his lifetime. And I am delighted I got to speak with his co-writer, Kat, about working with Stan Lee on this one-of-a-kind audio storytelling experience. Kat is a gifted writer who understands the complexity of youth culture and owning one's voice when it comes to storytelling. Narrated by the inspiring Yara Shahidi, Stan Lee's Alliances, A Trick of Light, introduces listeners to a mysterious young woman, Nia, whose fate is intertwined with a seemingly ordinary Midwestern teenager, Cameron Ackerson, whose quest for YouTube stardom takes him to the heart of the Great Lakes Triangle, where he is imbued with the power to see and hear a new reality. The truly immersive new title is currently available on Audible, and I will link to it on my website. You can find us at theother50%.com for added features, photos, show notes, and the merchandise. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places. And also the full season of Catch a Break, The Insider's Guide to Getting Into and Navigating Hollywood, is now available on Apple Podcasts and all the podcast places and on the website, catchabreakpodcast.com. Go check that one out too, because we are actively working on season 2. All right, here's my conversation with Kat Rosenfield. Have a listen. I'm here with Kat Rosenfield, and we're here to talk about your new project, which is Stan Lee's Alliances, A Trick of Light. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to talk to you. Let's talk about the project first, but then I also want to talk about your career as a writer, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So let's talk about this project. I know it's narrated by Yara Shahidi. I'm such a fangirl of hers. She's incredible.
We were so lucky to get her.
Oh, she's amazing. So what is this project?
So A Trick of Light is one of Stan's last collaborations that he worked on during his lifetime. And it is an Audible original audiobook. So it's basically an immersive storytelling experience narrated, as we said, by Yara Shahidi. And this was a chance to innovate for Stan, incredibly, in his 90s. This was a medium that he had never worked in before.
So rather than writing a book, you guys wrote it as an audiobook?
Yeah. So when I came onto the project, we knew that we wanted to do this for audio. I wouldn't say that particularly changed the actual writing process. It's still, about creating a story. But yeah, that was always the idea, for it to be an Audible original.
And how did you meet Stan Lee?
I was brought on after the concept was developed. So Luke Lieberman, who's one of my collaborators, had this long-standing mentorship with Stan Lee dating all the way back to the early 2000s. And they had always wanted to collaborate on something together. And the fascination with technology that's kind of a tenet of all of Stan's storytelling, in the early 2000s, he was really interested in the internet and in its sort of possibilities for connecting us, for bringing people together, for facilitating communication on a global scale. And then fast forward about 15 years later, it, was kind of clear that for all the promise of the internet, it also had done some somewhat negative things to how we connect with each other. And so Stan and Luke developed this story concept surrounding these questions, these what ifs, that Stan was always kind of presciently able to ask about what kind of an impact technology was having on us. And in this case, it was, in the digital age, when we inhabit these digital spaces, what does that do to our relationships with each other? What does it change? What does it tell us about who we are, and what does it do to how we connect? So once that idea had kind of taken root, there was some story development that took place, concept development, character creation before I came on board. Ryan Silbert, who's my other collaborator, became part of the project at that point. And then eventually I was brought on to write it.
Now, how was that experience? Like, was it what you expected, or was it surprising? How did you kind of work together?
It was actually remarkable for me. I'm coming from a background in long form literary fiction. So I had never written a story as a kind of a team sport before. I always associated, creating a book with, as being a kind of a lonely experience. You go into like a cave, you spend 2 years in there eating a lot of takeout, probably not wearing pants. And then eventually you emerge with a manuscript, hopefully. So this was a completely different experience. It was incredibly collaborative, everybody contributing to the development of the story before the writing began.
So it sounds almost like kind of a process that you would do for film for television, where you would have did you have like a writer's room and break it down and get different assignments? How did you piece it out?
Oh, no. It was everybody contributed, kind of wholesale to the development of the story. And then, once it was time to write, that was, me working with notes from Stan, collaborating with him directly.
Got it. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the story?
Okay, so I have to be really, really careful. I'm so afraid that every time I start talking about this, that I'm going to open my mouth and like every spoiler in the world is going to come falling out.
Okay, go just to the point where you have to kill me afterwards.
Right,
like
right.
Just short of that.
Super broad strokes. You in A Trick of Light will meet Cameron and Nia, who are two young people, both of them with gifts. And they have a connection with each other that is powerful enough to either save the world or to destroy it entirely. So that's all I can say plot specific wise. But in broad strokes, this is very much a story about human connection and identity in the digital age.
Well, that sounds like the stakes are not very high at all.
Just the fate of the world hanging in the balance. No big deal.
That's all. No big whoop. Can we talk about your career a little bit? How did you know you were a writer, and how did you start?
So I tried to kind of create a timeline of my career, and how I developed as a writer before, I sat down to talk to you, and it looked like one of those like serial killer hunting tableaus where it's like all
oh, no.
Like a bunch of like headline or like news clippings connected by red thread. But basically writing is something that I always enjoyed and I had a sort of a facility for it. I remember in college being able to create coherent essays like in an evening, without trying too hard. But after that, I ended up being steered into more jobs that required like quote unquote writing skills. It was like writing was never going to be enough on its own. It sort of never occurred to me that could be a career path. So I ended up in public relations, where there was some writing involved, but not enough to be really great for me. It also required a lot of kind of schmoozing and event planning, which are things that I am profoundly terrible at. So I eventually realized that I really wanted to do what the journalists I was talking to all day were doing, segued into copywriting, and I basically started freelancing for anywhere that would take me. I got some advice from the journalists I knew to kind of say yes to everything and just start building a portfolio. And at that point, I began writing for this MTV blog called Hollywood Crush. That was sort of my first entree into the entertainment industry. And after that, fast forward to the recession, I lost my day job, and I had been working on this novel. My husband said, well, maybe this is your opportunity to actually finish the thing. So that was sort of how I ended up becoming a full-time writer and full-time freelance writer.
It always feels terrible in the moment and then turns out to be a blessing in disguise, right?
Yeah. I mean, boy, did it feel terrible in the moment. It's hard to believe that was like 10 years ago.
So then was that novel published?
Yeah, that actually ended up being my first novel, Amelia Ann is Dead and Gone. And that was published in 2012. So it took me a little while to finish it and to sell it and to send it through the process. But it really did end up being kind of a fortuitous thing.
Now, how many novels do you have?
I have published 2. The last one was called Inland, and it was released in 2014. And then, of course, there is this upcoming collaboration with Stan.
That's wonderful. Is your typical genre young adult?
I sort of stumbled into writing for YA by accident. And at the time, it was basically just a question of the story I had written had an 18-year-old protagonist. So, that was at the time that made the novel YA. But I've always been sort of connected to youth and internet culture. And in the journalism I do, writing for MTV, I was very focused on young Hollywood. I was writing this teen advice column for Spark Notes where kids would write with questions about, how to deal with their relationships or their parents. So I've always been sort of in that space exploring digital relationships, digital culture.
It sounds like you are a writer for our modern times.
I guess that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, I'll take that.
Very contemporary. And I'd love to ask you what you kind of make of what has happened with women over the last few years.
Well, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for getting women's voices out there. And, deservedly so, because as a question of fairness, purely, we're half the population and we should be in there. We should be represented accordingly in publishing and in writers' rooms and, in all of those prestigious literary awards that they're handing out.
Yes, we should definitely be in the game. We are the other 50%. I know it's sometimes for women especially, it can be a real journey to the place where you can actually find your own authentic voice. Was that kind of a journey for you, or did it come easily? Like, do you have any advice as to how to get to that?
This is interesting. This actually speaks to something that I still see happening a lot, and I think is really regrettable. And I think maybe it happens more in the nonfiction world, but where women are almost being pigeonholed or asked to kind of prove their bona fides, where it's like they're being told that they need to kind of autopsy their traumas or their damage to be taken seriously as writers. And it feeds into the idea that this kind of trauma porn, I guess is basically the way to phrase it, is all we're good for. And then at the same time, every time a woman steps into that sphere, it's like it has to be accompanied by all of these apologies for having the audacity to take up space as a writer in the first place, to have the audacity to use her voice. So as far as that goes, I think that the best thing women can do, who want to write, is just stop apologizing. Just stop.
I love that. And I love that you brought this up because it has been a real, like, we're in the middle of this era right now that if a woman wants to make a film, it has to be, as you said, like unearthing her own trauma and laying it bare. And that doesn't feel particularly fair either. Like, why can't women just tell stories?
It's so limiting. And, honestly, something that Stan and I shared was a foundational belief that it doesn't have to be like that. Storytelling is universal. Stories are for everyone. Every story is for everyone. And, he didn't subscribe to this kind of limited, stay in your lane, pigeonholing ethos as a writer. And I don't either. Mm-hmm. He always said that the characters were the most important, that having relatable characters meant that, your audience would follow them anywhere. And that what made them relatable was this emotional journey, that it should feel compelling and it should feel real. And I think actually what's really cool about having done this project for audio is that it so fully underscores how a woman's voice can be a universal voice. We have Yara Shahidi, who is a young woman of color, as our narrator, and she does a phenomenal job. But what's fascinating to me about this medium is that once she starts reading, all you have to do is get like a minute in, and you don't think, oh, I'm listening to Yara Shahidi telling me a story. Like, I'm listening to Yara Shahidi do a man voice, to voice this character. You hear Cameron, you hear Wako, she fully inhabits she plays every role. And there's nothing strange about that. There's something so immersive about just listening to this narrative.
I love it. And it is such an intimate medium. And I love what you said about the female voice the story being universal, because forever it's been whatever the white man's story is the universal story and everyone should relate. And everybody and everything else is niche and only appeals to that particular thing. And I think where we need to get to is where everybody's story becomes universal.
Absolutely. Every story should be for everyone. And, I read a ton growing up. I was such a nerd. And I always, I related to characters of all stripes. And, it wasn't just the ones who looked like me. Some of the characters I related to most deeply were the ones who didn't look like me. But there was something about the way they felt and the way that they approached the world that resonated for me. And I think that can be true for anybody.
Yeah, it's really great. I'm curious, was there anything specific you took away from working with Stan Lee that will influence your work in a different way going forward?
I mean, this project really introduced me, I said this a little bit earlier, but to the joy and the rich creative sphere that is collaboration. And Stan has always worked this way. He's always been about kind of creating, a bullpen of writers, of, creative minds who can supply ideas to kind of build a story as a team effort. And I'm not saying that I'll never write another book alone again, but I never expected it to be so rewarding. And, to when you're in a room with all of these just brilliant nerds, either a virtual space or just sitting across the table from them, and you're all bouncing ideas off of each other, what you come up with is something just phenomenal. And it's so much fun.
Yeah, it sounds so fun. And then I imagine also, did you have to kind of back up from, did you have a moment of, oh my God, I'm in the room with a legend, be cool?
Oh gosh. I mean, anytime, for the record, not just me, my collaborators were fanboying their pants off too,
I'm sure everybody.
Yeah. It's I'm working with Stan Lee. God, pinch me. What is this?
That's so great. What is next for you?
Well, for the moment, I've been working on this for such a long time, and I haven't been able to talk about it with anybody because it's been this super secret project. So I am just so excited now that on June 27th, this book is finally going to be released on Audible. It's going to be shared with millions of people. It's finally going to be, in everyone's ears and not just in my head. I'm so excited.
Yeah, that is really thrilling. Are you hooked now? Do you want to do more audio projects like this?
Oh, I mean, I definitely would love to. Yeah.
If you had any advice for women coming up behind you, what would your advice be? I
think my advice is, it's the same advice that I give to anybody who wants to kind of break into creative work, and then maybe just with a little extra oomph on it, because I think that being assertive is a particular challenge for women. But just, get in there. It's that work is yours to do. Take it. Say yes to everything. Go after crazy opportunities. And I mean, for me, I did not come from a comics background. I thought it was the biggest long shot ever that I might get to work on this project. But I pursued it, and it ended up being one of the coolest things I've ever gotten to do. So I would say, be hungry, be curious, go out there and just aggressively pursue the work.
I love that. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in upstate New York in a really small town called Coxsackie. And honestly, it's full of cows and not a whole lot else.
I've never even heard of that town before.
I always say that unless you know somebody in prison, you probably haven't. That's the other thing we have in abundance. Cows in prisons. Beautiful.
Oh my
beautiful
gosh.
Rural New York State. It was a great place to grow up, though. I'm not knocking my hometown at all.
And then where'd you go to college?
I went to Drew University in New Jersey.
Okay. And did you study writing?
I actually majored in art.
Hold on now. What kind of art?
So I did visual arts, and I ended up doing my concentration in printmaking. I really liked linoleum. you carve things into it and then you ink it up. It's like this very physical form of printmaking, and you get really covered in ink, and then you run it through this huge press. It was just a blast. I did not.
Oh my God, that sounds so fun to me.
It is so cool. I stumbled into it. I'd never done it before I went to school, or maybe I'd done it a little bit, coming up in high school, but I ended up really enjoying it. And even then I was always kind of interested in making work that, was sort of pop culture inflected. Maybe my subconscious was trying to tell me something, but my favorite thing that I made, for my senior thesis was this incredibly detailed portrait of Christopher Walken that I reproduced like hundreds of times and turned into this huge grid. And it was just Walken, just like 100 Walken.
I love it. I love it. I did not know you could major in that. I might have majored in that. That sounds so fun.
Yeah, it was a blast. I have never told anybody about that. Actually, it's like that's my dark secret. I once made Christopher Walken fan art.
Well, now you've told everybody.
Right.
So do you live in New York City now?
I did, but now my husband and I live in Connecticut.
Oh, how lovely. What did I not ask you that I should have asked you? So Stan Lee's Alliance as a Trick of Light is available on Audible as a book, released on June 27th. So this is going to air early July, so I'm sure people can still go get it, and they should.
Yes, they definitely should.
Thank you so much for talking with me. This is really fun.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, a herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. I'd like to thank Kat Rosenfield for sharing her story. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on your favorite podcast provider and leave a review. And of course on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, and the merch. And you can also follow us on all the social media platforms. And go subscribe to catchabreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.